We're delighted that you're here with us today to attend today's session. This event is being hosted by the International State Crime Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary research center based at the School of Law at Queen Mary University. And like most of our events, this session focuses on the structural crimes of governments and the profound toll that they have on the lives of individuals and communities. If you'd like to know more about our center and to get involved with some of the work that we do at the International State Crime Initiative, we'll post some links shortly into the chat box. You may also want to be aware that we are recording this event. So if you would not like to have your face on screen, you can turn your camera off. And we'll also share the recording with you later on after the session has taken place. I'm really thrilled to be introducing today our absolutely fantastic panel. The panel has been organized off the back of a recently released special issue of the State Crime Journal. And it takes as its focus the global pandemic's relationship to different forms of state criminality and structural violence. All of the panelists have contributed to the special issue, and they'll be discussing these themes and the relationships and the pandemic's impacts from their various areas of expertise. So without further ado, I think I'll just jump right in and briefly introduce our panelists so that we can get started with the session. We have 4 panelists with us here today. Our session is going to start with some remarks by Professor Neve Gordon. Neve Gordon is a professor of international law and human rights at Queen Mary University School of Law, and he's also an executive board member of the International State Crime Initiative. Professor Gordon's research focuses on international humanitarian law, human rights, new warfare technologies, the ethics of violence, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Professor Gordon's latest book, Human Shields, A History of People in the Line of Fire, follows the marginal and controversial figure of the human shield over 150 years to interrogate the laws of war and how the ethics of humane violence is produced. We also have with us here today Hilal Elver, who served as the Special Rapporteur on the right to food between 2014 and 2020. And she is also an international law professor and a global distinguished fellow at the UCLA Law School's Resnick Food Law and Policy Center. She is also a research professor at the UC Santa Barbara, where she has been a distinguished visiting professor since 2002. Her publications have focused on environmental law, climate change, food security, human rights, and women's rights. And she has recently published a co-edited book called Reimagining Climate Change. We also have with us Laura Finley, who is a professor of sociology and criminology at Barry University. Dr. Finley's work focuses on critical issues in criminal justice, juvenile delinquency, international perspectives on crime and criminal justice, the sociology of violence, elite and organized crime, and perspective consciousness and social justice. And Dr. Finley has published a number of articles and books on various social justice topics. And finally, last but not least, we have with us Elizabeth Bradshaw, who is a professor in sociology at Central Michigan University. Dr. Bradshaw has published widely on the intersection of state corporate crime and green criminology, including state corporate environmental crime in the fossil fuel industry, resistance by social movements to crimes of the powerful, and toxic prisons as a form of green state crime. So having introduced the members of our distinguished panel, I now would like to turn over to the chair of this session, Professor Neve Gordon, who will start our discussion. Neve?
Yeah, let me unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I would also like to begin by thanking people. I'd like to begin by thanking Angela Sherwood and Gulsh Khatun for organizing the event, Sophia Knowles Mulford for organizing the special issue and being responsible from it from the very beginning to the end, and to Professors Hilal Elvar, Laura Finley, and Elizabeth Bradshaw for joining us today. Professor Penny Green, who founded the International State Crime Initiative and the State Crime Journal, I think with Tony Ward, who is here with us today, Professor Green and I wrote the introduction to the special issue. About a month after the first lockdown was imposed, we understood that the pandemic and the response to it shed light on state crime. We witnessed how 3 weeks after the COVID-19 outbreak, the Hungarian parliament confirmed formidable executive powers on Prime Minister Orbán, allowing him to rule by decree. Meanwhile, the Chilean government sent the military to public squares that had until recently been occupied by protesters, while in the Philippines, police arrested over 40,000 people within the first 11 days of the country's lockdown on charges of violating quarantine policies. While the introduction of emergency measures to address the global pandemic were undoubtedly necessary, such forms of intervention seem to underscore how governments could exploit the COVID-19 crisis to introduce measures that undermine democratic principles and violate the civil and political rights of both citizens and migrants. We characterize such state crimes as government overreach, where the executive arm uses its powers to undercut basic freedoms. But we also believe that the crimes of government overreach have, to a significant extent, been overshadowed by more structural and attritional forms of violence, less commonly understood as state crimes. We frame these largely structural crimes as products of government underreach. Government underreach, it is important to emphasize, should not be identified with the absence of government intervention. Rather, it denotes forms of intervention designed to implement certain kinds of deregulation and austerity measures and that have led to the evisceration of welfare policies and the erosion of the social safety net. This, to be sure, is not a new phenomenon. Long before the outbreak of the COVID-19 emergency measures, cronyism and mass disinvestment in public services and infrastructure inhibited the human rights and life chances of millions. In the pandemic, many governments used emergency measures to accelerate processes of deregulation and outsourcing, handing out large and at times vast amounts of taxpayers' money to corporations to fulfill tasks traditionally carried out by the public sectors. While the media has exposed the corrupt side of this clientelist practices, the articles in this special issue use COVID-19 as a springboard to uncover the relationship between structural violence and state crime. The authors show how colonial history and neo-colonial practices characterized by wide-scale exploitation of resources, political corruption, repression, and poverty create an intensified vulnerability to natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, and pandemics. The poor state of public health systems, which tends to be underfunded and lacking in adequate medicines, equipment, and staff, is not natural, but due to the subordination of poor countries to the interest of the world's wealthiest states and largest transnational corporations. This is currently apparent in the way the vaccines are being distributed around the globe, which some commentators have aptly described as vaccine apartheid. Hillel Elvar will, I believe, discuss a different kind of apartheid in her talk, the one relating to food security around the globe and how in the pandemic's wake, corporate state alliances have undermined the food security of millions of people. To be sure, the criminal exploitation and carelessness does not only characterize the relation between the global north and global south, or between countries more generally. It is also widespread within countries. The early claim that COVID-19 was an equalizer, killing both the rich and the poor, black and white, was swiftly revealed to be false. This is nowhere clearer than in Laura Finley's article about the virus's impact on Native Americans, and I'm sure we will hear from her about the importance of connecting the pandemic's impact to the historic state crimes carried out in the United States against Native Americans. Similarly, historical processes have to be analyzed to understand why Black Americans have experienced the highest COVID-19 mortality rates, more than twice the rate of whites and Asians. We know that if they had died of COVID-19 at the same rate as white Americans, tens of thousands of Black Americans would not have lost their lives to the virus. We will need to keep this in mind as we listen to Elizabeth Bradshaw's talk about how the U.S. COVID-19 crisis has intersected with its mass incarceration project. Highlighting the pandemic's racialized disparities, which have had the most profound effect on Black and elderly prisoners, Bradshaw will, I imagine, advance the concept of state-organized race crime. Like an earthquake that shatters a city, filling the streets with debris and leaving only the bare infrastructure exposed, COVID-19 has been uncovering some of the historic crimes that the United States and other countries have perpetrated against indigenous and racialized populations. Also, like an earthquake, the destruction and death in the pandemic's wake are neither inevitable nor entirely natural. Investigative work by the Good Law Project and other groups have documented in some detail the special pathways by which cronyism and clientelism, hallmarks of certain forms of capitalist criminal processes, have advanced the interest of private corporations at the expense of public health in numerous countries around the world. A pattern thus emerges. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, we have witnessed governments around the world gifting highly lucrative contracts to their corporate supporters, who in turn have failed to deliver the necessary services they were contracted to provide. It is crucial, however, to underscore that criminal profiteering and criminal carelessness refers not only or even primarily to corrupt state-corporate interactions. While journalists, researchers, and human rights organizations have done outstanding work exposing the corrupt interactions between politicians and CEOs, the primary crime manifests itself in the economic and social effects of these schemes and is predominantly propelled by the social and economic structures informing capitalist society. Recognizing that the violence produced in and through social structure is both a driving force and a manifestation of state crime is not always a simple matter. This criminality is rarely identified as such because crime continues to be generally perceived as a discrete act perpetrated by individuals and defined as criminal by law. Yet in addition to the more overt, agent-driven acts of state crime such as genocide, torture, and grand corruption, we have in recent decades witnessed austerity measures that have starved the health system and the social safety net more generally, starved them of necessary basic resources. This kind of defunding is in line with the neoliberal agenda and, while not defined as criminal by state law, has led to mass human suffering and countless unnecessary death. A decade ago, Rob Nixon maintained that the harmful effects of structural violence tend to manifest themselves gradually over time, precipitating slow violence, as he calls it, which is protracted, attritional, and less viscerally shocking than the violence perpetuated by social agents. It is still too early to say exactly how the pandemic will impact the structures of violence affecting our lives in the longer term, and whether it will ultimately serve to increase or reduce state criminality. It seems clear that if the lessons of the pandemic are to give rise to a concerted challenge to the unequal and deadly political and economic structures of capitalist society, our best means is through mass mobilization of civil society. The pandemic could potentially force states to acknowledge and address the historical violence directed against marginal populations, and it could propel a move towards reparations and redistribution while also improving access to public goods by nationalizing public services through, for example, a Green New Deal. Such a deal would enable states to create millions of new jobs, to establish green networks and infrastructures by replacing fossil fuels and with renewable energy. These are the necessary stepping stones for creating more caring economies and societies. What the articles in this collection reveal so starkly is that the pandemic has not only helped expose underlying, largely hidden state crimes, but it has also created an opportunity for more caring societies. It is now up to civil society, up to us, given its preeminent role in defining, exposing, and challenging state crime, to force states to make that change. And so now I will leave it to the next speaker, who is Angela.
We'll have Halal next, if that's okay.
You want me to start, guys?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to the event organizers and for those in virtual attendance today. I'm pleased to join you all to discuss my recent article that I co-authored with Melissa Shapiro. She's not able to attend to this event because she has another kind of event at exactly the same time. So in this article, we started to make it clear that the situation, the abusive treatment of food system workers should not just be deemed a violation of human rights, but designated as a state crime. We are trying to argue this. While I was a United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food, I embraced my role as the leading global advocate for the human rights to food. And I examined the extent to which states around the world have progressively realized this right, adopting legal frameworks consistent with the fundamental obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights. Yes, yet I also noticed that too often, absent from the conversation, were the faces hidden behind our foods, the 1.3 billion agricultural workers who comprise 1/3 of the world's labor force, and the countless others who are engaged in preparation, distribution, bringing to our house the food. These workers are vital to the realization of the right to food of others, the ability to access available, adequate food at all the times. But too often, these workers are food insecure, unable to enjoy their own fundamental human rights. This is often due to the precarious conditions in which food systems workers are employed, laboring in complex and impenetrable supply chains outside the reach of formal contracts and legal protections. Yet the severity of the situation is compounded by the fact that most food system workers who are subject to the worst abuses are undocumented migrants and racial and ethnic minorities. These populations are less likely to have clearly recognizable rights in the eyes of the state or be granted access to justice for harms carried out by corporate actors. There are currently few countries with adequate legal protection for food system workers enshrined in law, despite the instruction of ILO and human rights instruments to enforce safe and non-discriminatory working conditions, provide a living wage, ensure access to justice. Even if states recognize that food system workers are in principle entitled to legal protections, far too many workers lack social protections and remain targets for xenophobia and systemic discrimination. Instead, states offer sparse and fragmented laws that apply to food system workers and are increasingly turning to public-private partnerships as a means to promote greater corporate social responsibility and sustainable food production. Increasingly, our food supply chains are becoming globalized, with control concentrated in only a handful of these private corporate actors. In principle, these actors bear a responsibility to monitor and protect against exploitation. In reality, however, those with concentrated wealth have exerted direct political influence over government agenda setting, and states in turn are turning a blind eye towards corporate abuse of power. The failure of states to take action on behalf of workers and to instead exhibit solidarity with corporate actors is signaling to civil society that food system workers are disposable and that the violations of their rights are not only morally acceptable but legally permissible. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has devastated food systems around the world, forced states to confront this message. Around the world, governments acknowledge the importance of all supply chain workers, declaring this group as an essential during the crisis. Yet, this designation did not translate into the provision of protective equipment or an expansion of legal or social protections, while the virus rapidly spread. Rather, governments presented workers who harvest, process, and distribute food with an impossible choice: risk their livelihoods or risk their lives. The article published in the State Crime Journal argues that, against this backdrop, there is a need for international and national upsurge of civil and judicial activism, as well as the criminalization of international state complicity in the deliberate or grossly negligent private sector abuse of food system workers. International human rights law and labor law provide foundational, yet aspirational protections for workers, many of which have not been translated into meaningful, concrete safeguards codified in national laws. The gaps in protection are evident around the world. Not only are we seeing persistent abuse of workers around the world, but we are also seeing that the few avenues to justice do not implicate private sector actors who are directly carrying out the mistreatments. Gig economy lawsuits in the EU and liability claims brought in the US against major meat producers like Tyson's for COVID-related safety violations at production plants have not resulted in meaningful repercussions for private sector actors or the states in which the violations occur. Thus, states have no incentive to adopt greater protections for workers that will mitigate further harm. It is apparent that states lack the political will or incentives to adopt preventive protections, implement monitoring mechanisms, and enforce against abuses against food system workers. These are almost no assurance in national law or practice that guarantee agricultural workers the medical attention and health protection. It is surprising that private corporate actors and civil society believe that the mistreatment and violations of workers' rights are not only acceptable, if not inevitable. The formalization of new state crime offers a potential avenue to hold governments accountable, which we propose, when they remain complicit in the mistreatment of food system workers. Applying state crime theory to the situation would account for two distinct drivers that are perpetrating abuse of workers. First is the unmonitored pursuit by private actors to minimize the protection of these workers as a means to cut costs and ensure profitability. Second is the practice of states to embrace free market economy rules and global competition without adopting adequate safeguards for workers. As our article demonstrates, it is a past time to adopt a new state crime that holds states accountable for failing to afford legal protections for all food system workers and for feigning ignorance of the oppression and discrimination to which undocumented migrant and minority status workers are disproportionately subject. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Halal. If we could now turn to Laura Finlay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all so much for letting me be here today, and greetings at 9:30 a.m. from sunny South Florida. So I'm going to share a couple PowerPoint slides to kind of guide what I discussed in my article, and I'll try to do that as quickly as possible. There's more here that I'm not going to say, but you'll see, I guess. But hopefully I'll get to the basic point. So what I was interested in was taking a look at the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Native Americans regarding both cases and fatalities, as well as the disproportionate effect of stay-at-home orders and other responses on that population. So I connected this to settler colonialism as a form of state crime that has long created structural disadvantage among Native Americans. I focus mostly on the United States, but similar issues can be found in other places where amongst indigenous people where settler colonialism was an issue. So here we go. Settler colonialism involves, of course, the taking of removal of indigenous people to take their land. It occurs through a number of different mechanisms. Largely in the states, this was through broken or ignored treaties with the federal government, the imposition of culturally incompatible systems and ideologies, for instance, in criminal justice, in education. And it's long been propped up by some sort of narrative of benevolence. You know, here in the states, we heard manifest destiny. It's like, you know, white people's given right to take this land because, of course, they are superior and better able to use it. And this then can be considered a form of slow violence, as Nixon identified, or state crime. I do talk fast, so hopefully I can not talk too fast to lose y'all. I liked the quote from Jones at the top because it indicates that this is not, the disproportionate effect on Native people of COVID is not new, that there have been previous pandemics where Native Americans have suffered disproportionately as well. So Jones notes, going back to the earliest days of colonization and even as recently as the 1980 influenza pandemic, which was 4 times more lethal within the tribes, Native Americans have borne the worst of this country's diseases. This occurred through deliberate spreading of diseases, as well as through structural inequalities that exacerbated the exposure to disease that Native people were not accustomed to, including warfare by colonists and the government, the trade of native slaves, as well as forced removals like the Trail of Tears and others. So these disadvantages were the result of both policy as well as exposure to disease, and the combination of those things disproportionately affected Native Americans with various pandemics. And so I read the quote because I think it really stuck out to me as I was writing the article. Native vulnerability had and has nothing to do with racial inferiority or, since those initial incidents, lack of immunity. Rather, it has everything to do with concrete policies pursued by the United States government, its states, and its citizens. So this settler colonialism has created a situation of structural disadvantage among American Indian or Native American people, and it started from the get-go, of course. In fact, even that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which oversees Native and federal government relations, was first housed in the War Department. That, again, sends a pretty powerful message. So this structural advantage creates a situation where Native peoples have to navigate a huge bureaucracy to even utilize their own lands. It shocked me when I investigated this to find that it takes at least 4 different federal entities and at least 49 steps to actually engage in a development project on your own land. Created the imposition of different criminal justice systems that overrepresent American Indian and Native American peoples and that are culturally incompatible to the more restorative practices that most used before settler colonization. Created inadequate education systems, including removal of young people to boarding schools to take the Indian out of them. And even today, I would make the argument our educational attention, our media attention to American Indian and Native American peoples is very poor. As a result, their high poverty and unemployment rates, inadequate access to clean water and sewage, high alcohol alcoholism, and other rates of other disease that exacerbate COVID-19, and high rates of domestic and sexual violence, among many other things. All of this is exacerbated by poor funding of the Indian Health Service, which oversees healthcare on Native American reservations, and inadequate medical care then as a result. So what have we seen with COVID-19? So Native American people have severely been overrepresented in both cases and fatalities. In May of 2020, the Navajo were actually the most affected demographic in the United States, and many other nations were among the tops. It actually took months, though, before Native American peoples were even included in data about COVID cases. The data was not presented necessarily that included them as a separate racial category. They were often included in other, which is not the first time that's happened. That happened in the 2010 census as well. And so, of course, that affects in the United States the proportion of other resources. We see, as I mentioned, pre-existing conditions like diabetes, alcoholism, and things that make COVID worse, of course, again, are a factor. And our reservation lands are generally very geographically large with very minimal healthcare facilities, making it much more difficult for Native people to get to testing, to get to help, etc. There were delays in the receipt of federal funds. So the United States passed something called the CARES Act, and Native nations were allowed to apply to get those funds. It was sometimes weeks, if not even months, before they received the funding that they were due. And one particularly upsetting case was the Seattle Indian Health Board asked for coronavirus tests in mid-March. 3 weeks later, they did not receive those tests, but what they received as a shipment was body bags. Obviously, this was an error, but a pretty telling one, and certainly not one that's funny at the time of a killer global pandemic. One of the primary tools, of course, in addressing how coronavirus spreads is contact tracing, which is very difficult on Native lands, not only because they're geographically spread, but many people lack electricity, lack cell phones, or if they have phones or electricity, are hesitant to use them much because they wanted to reserve them in case there was an actual emergency in which they needed to have their phone charged up to be able to make a call. On Native lands, many live in very tight quarters, multi-generational homes, which of course makes it difficult to contain the virus. So just a real quick, what has been done, what can be done, and excited to entertain questions and things later. But so far now that we've had vaccinations in the United States, that's actually been rolling out very well amongst Native American groups, in particular the Navajo. And so I think that's really important to point out and say, this is, despite all these challenges, people have done really well in terms of helping to address the solution, or at least the sort of solution to the coronavirus. Our new President Biden has named Deb Haaland the Secretary of the Interior. So she is the first Native American in a cabinet level position and will oversee the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I think that's going to be helpful, of course. Many scholars, Native scholars, I am obviously not, but many Native scholars argue that the real answer is going to be to work on decolonization and honoring the many treaties, the more than 350 treaties the United States government reneged on with the Native peoples. But reality is short-term relief needs to happen as well in terms of financial resources, medical resources, etc. And there is a long and wonderful history of Indigenous activism, both in the United States as well as around the globe. For instance, the protests about the Standing Rock about pipeline, Idle No More is a Canadian group. So just honoring and supporting the fact that Indigenous people are active, they're not a static population, and yet they've had this entire history of settler colonialism, state crime, and disadvantage, which made COVID all the worse amongst that population. So that is what I wanted to present for the day. I will stop my sharing, and again, I'm happy to entertain questions when the time comes.
Thanks so much, Laura. Our last speaker is Elizabeth.
All right. Thank you all for coming today, and a big thank you to the organizers for putting this all together and inviting me to participate. The paper that I contributed to the special issue looks at the spread of COVID-19 across Michigan's prison system, specifically between the months of April and May, so really the early time of the pandemic. And Michigan isn't a special case. I live in the state of Michigan. I also teach inside of a prison here in Michigan, and so it really kind of drew my attention because of that. But Michigan Michigan really epitomizes what's going on in prisons across the United States. So it's a decent case study. The U.S. incarcerates more people in prisons, jails, and detention centers than any other country in the world, totaling 2.3 million people and representing 20% of the world's incarcerated population. Every individual state within the United States incarcerates people at a higher rate than nearly every other country on earth, and this includes the state of Michigan. Racial disparities are a defining feature of the U.S. criminal justice system, specifically involving African Americans. Black people are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate more than 5 times the imprisonment rate of whites. This has kind of been well stated by Michelle Alexander in her work, The New Jim Crow, in which she states that mass incarceration operates as a network system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race. So this is only the most recent form of racialized social control in the United States, which has stemmed from the history of slavery, moved into Jim Crow segregation, and now manifests itself within mass incarceration. Ward has called this, has used the term slow violence. He's using Rob Nixon's term slow violence to talk about the issue of state organized race crime. So this occurs when state actors, institutions commit or abet racialized violence and criminalize racially defined groups. It's characterized by more subtle forms of structural violence in which victimization is delayed, dispersed, and hidden. And the racial violence of state actors and institutions are really intertwined with social and historical relationships, rationalized in part by the criminalization of race. So this can, I think, really easily be boiled down to the discussion of institutional racism that's built into laws and policies throughout this country. Ward specifically says that mass incarceration and the resulting social exclusion is a foremost crisis of state organized race crime today. So I thought that this concept really helped to kind of explain not just what we see in terms of the outbreak of COVID within prisons, but also the crisis of mass incarceration that predated what we see right now, the most recent crisis. Within Michigan's prison system, well, let me step back here for a second. Nationwide, as of April 6, 2021, there have been at least 392,595 people in prisons who have tested positive for COVID-19, and at least 2,516 deaths from coronavirus amongst prisoners nationwide. Within Michigan, my initial paper just looked at April and May up through just to the beginning of June. And in Michigan, we saw an early and severe outbreak of COVID-19, both in the state as a whole, but also within the prison system, that took place in nearly a dozen out of the 28 correctional facilities. And it represented some of the top national hotspots across the whole country. By May of 2020, Michigan had the highest prisoner death rate and the 3rd highest number of positive cases. By the start of June, 3,918, so nearly 4,000 prisoners had tested positive for COVID-19, and 68 prisoners had died. Over 53% of the positive prisoner cases and nearly half of the total prisoner deaths were people of color, particularly African Americans, and this mirrored racial disparities of the Michigan prison population more broadly. During the first wave, most deaths occurred among prisoners over age 50, with 1/3 of deaths concentrated within geriatric units. Within the state of Michigan, we do not have the death penalty in contrast to a few other states across our country. So life without the possibility of parole is the most severe sentence that you can receive within the state. And so we have a much larger population of aging prisoners, and coronavirus really took its toll on that population. Since June of 2020, when a lot of the data from the paper was used, a massive wave of infections has spread across the Michigan Department of Corrections system, specifically last fall. Since then, 2 out of 3 prisoners in Michigan have tested positive, which is 8.7 times higher than the overall rates in Michigan. Michigan now has 140 deaths, so double the number that we initially saw. And this is the state with the highest rate of deaths. And the pandemic, I think, really provides us an opportunity to reflect on how decades of punitive policies have created a crisis of mass incarceration with all its racial disparities, that it really set the stage in terms of prison overcrowding, lack of access to medical care, other issues like that, that have allowed the virus to flourish within the Department of Corrections in Michigan. So just to kind of reflect on how the slow violence of these racially disparate punitive policy decisions, I think there's three things we really need to look at within Michigan, but this also is reflective of the larger nation as a whole in terms of sentencing trends. Truth in sentencing laws, increasing use of life and long-term sentences, and declining parole rates. So in the 90s, the late 1990s, Michigan adopted one of the most punitive truth in sentencing laws in the country. While most states and the federal government were really pushing for prisoners to serve 85% of their minimum sentence before they were eligible for parole, Michigan took that to another level and said that prisoners would have to serve 100% of their minimum sentence before they could even be considered or go in front of the parole board. And so what this really did is it led to a rapid growth of Michigan's prison population. So it's important to note that during this time, it wasn't that more people were entering prisons. It was that they were serving longer sentences, which increased the prison population. Along with that, the increasing use of life and long-term sentences, Michigan leads the country in the average length of stay, both for violent crimes and drug crimes, which has increased over time. 13.5% of Michigan's total prison population is serving life sentences, and 65.8% of the prisoners serving life without parole life sentences are Black, compared to only 33% of white lifers. And so just to kind of give you context, within the state of Michigan, the African-American population as a whole is only about 14%. So to see nearly 66% of the population of those serving life without parole being Black, you can kind of see those racial disparities there. There's also declining parole rates. So amidst this conservative political climate, this led the parole board to embrace the idea that life means life, the position that resulted in these declining enroll rates and the reduction in granting of parole for prisoners. This also led to increased prison populations and a larger aging prisoner population, which requires much more healthcare needs because of their chronic conditions, which is also reflective of a national trend of a graying prison population. Despite all of this, despite some key missteps on behalf of the Department of Corrections in Michigan, Michigan has kind of been identified in a number of different publications as kind of a leader. If we're going to say that all states are failing to address the coronavirus population within prisons, Michigan is a leader within that category, kind of ranking as a D is what they've been given this grade in terms of how well they're performing. So although they were one of the early states to implement testing, they also took a number of incorrect steps, including continuing to transfer prisoners throughout the pandemic, incorrectly reporting testing results to prisoners, delayed testing for prisoners and staff, which all resulted in unnecessary exposure and infections and death from COVID-19. Ultimately, the Department of Corrections has no authority to release vulnerable and medically frail prisoners because of the truth in sentencing legislation that was passed decades ago. And so this requires prisoners serve their 100% of their minimum sentence before they can be released. And so the Department of Corrections their hands are tied in that sense. An executive order by the governor to lift the truth in sentencing laws is the only mechanism for releasing vulnerable prisoners during the pandemic. And so far, the governor has been unwilling to take executive action. And that would be one of the immediate steps that could help with the prison overcrowding problem. So kind of in conclusion, racial disparities resulting from punitive policies like truth in sentencing laws, life sentences, and limited parole opportunities have created the current context of mass incarceration, both in Michigan and across the U.S. And in contrast to the fast-moving crisis of coronavirus, the groundwork for the slow violence of mass incarceration has been laid over the course of decades, which has set the stage for the current pandemic. So in order to avert further unnecessary suffering and death behind bars, we need to really utilize the immediate strategies towards decarceration. And this can be said not just for coronavirus, but much more broadly. Prison abolition is really the crux, gets at the crux of the issue that we see in this country. So to understand these racial disparities in COVID-19 case rates, we must look at the role of state actors and institutions in creating the social and historical context for structural violence to flourish. Government policy has directly and indirectly shaped race-based segregation, not only in mass incarceration, but in housing, schools, workplaces, and healthcare facilities, which have all resulted in higher rates of disease and premature death for minorities. So because of the breadth of institutional racism in the United States, we have ample opportunity to advance the concept of state organized race crime, especially amidst the coronavirus pandemic. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. We can now turn to having questions from the audience. As Neve has actually put it into the chat, if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or you can write it into the chat box. So we can now open up for questions for either direct your questions to all the panelists or to individual panelists, whatever you prefer.
I might begin with a question, actually, to follow up Elizabeth's presentation. I was struck when I read your article about the aging population in the prisons. And, you know, getting old is not easy outside of prison. And it seems to me that getting old in prison, and from what I understand, it's quite I'd like to hear more about what the size of this population, and is the prison authorities, are they required to make, you know, some people can't walk, some people, it becomes a very, some people have dementia, some people, if you could talk a bit about more and whether COVID helped expose a bit of that too.
Yeah, so if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, I think we have about 1,700 prisoners with who are either aging or have serious chronic care conditions within the Department of Corrections. And in total, the prison population has fluctuated between 36,000 and 38,000 more recently. Part of what happens for these elderly prisoners is that they are paired with prisoner observation aides or different aides, younger people who are also incarcerated who help them with their daily activities. And my understanding from my conversations with incarcerated people is that these are often seen as kind of more privileged and trustworthy jobs, but they're also very demanding because you were playing a hands-on caretaking role for people who really need this. And so I think that because we don't have the death penalty here in Michigan, that we have this large population, and the Department of Corrections, both here in the state and I think nationwide, were never set up to serve as nursing homes. But yet we see the same kind of trends within the elderly population inside of prisons that we see within nursing homes going on across the United States in terms of COVID-19. So I don't know that enough attention has been drawn to the aging populations behind bars and how much this has really affected them. I think that they've kind of got lumped in just with the larger group. And in my personal opinion, there hasn't been enough attention to the experiences of prisoners just more generally, in part because of their stigmatized status within society. So they've been kind of last in line to get vaccinations and things like this. So although I wish this would raise the larger issue, because data has shown and reports have documented that your likelihood of committing crime decreases with age, and this is especially true when you're getting up past your 50s. And so many of these people, these older prisoners, could be released without being a threat to public safety, and yet this really hasn't been discussed seriously within the state of Michigan as an option for reducing their vulnerability.
Thanks. We have a question in the chat box from Mayara. Sorry if I am not pronouncing that correctly. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I think this question is mostly for Neve, that I know has written about this, but goes to you all in the sense that I'm Brazilian, so I'm very close to all the news that are coming from Brazil right now in regards to the request for the impeachment of Bolsonaro. And recently there was another request based on the genocide of specifically the indigenous population. But I think we have a big problem now because the numbers are so high of the whole of the population that really small sections like the indigenous population will be a small number compared to the overall number, especially because individuals took their own action into trying to protect the indigenous populations. So healthcare workers went to live with these tribes in Brazil and try to keep them isolated and care for them. And that, to a certain extent, have protected them in the last, 5 months. So the numbers are slowly equating to the rest of the population. So by the end of this, we're probably not going to have a number that we can actually say that there was a difference in deaths, like you can say to what happened to the Navajos in the United States. And that really worries me because I can see how Bolsonaro will actually be protected by the massive tragedy that is happening right now. And I think to a certain extent that will happen to other countries that might have high numbers. And I would like to ask you guys, what can we do? How can we show their intent, and how can we actually use international help to show what has happened to my country? Because it's a tragedy, enormous tragedy. Thank you.
I'll begin, but I think Laura can say maybe more than me about this. I mean, I come also from a settler colonial society with indigenous population, and the settler colonial society doesn't care that much about indigenous deaths. It's actually the white death that is more valued. Because the white is more valued, then when more whites die or more settlers die, and that then it becomes a problem. So I think that Brazil's situation in the international community, or the way it's conceived at least among many members in the international community, is that you have a rogue president and someone that was aligned with Trump and whose vision of the world is very close to Trump. And so I don't think there is a major issue here in that sense, and I think we should be actually happy that the indigenous population is not dying in greater numbers. I think we should try to decrease the overall numbers in Brazil, but I understand your frustration with your leadership because you're at a moment in history that you have one of the worst leaderships in the world. But maybe Laura could add something to this.
I will. Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm just taking the unmute and stuff. I'll do a little bit that I can. And I think it's a really important question. I did look into Brazil a little bit in examining things, although my focus was on Native Americans. But my understanding is there's similar challenges in terms of existing structural disadvantages, geographic challenges, including even indigenous groups that have had very limited contact with outsiders in past, making them even more vulnerable to different exposures. And my understanding too is over decades, the Brazilian government has privileged agribusiness over the environment, over indigenous lands, and this is, again, much like we see in the United States, exacerbated the cases. I did find that of 305 tribes and about 900,000 people, and of indigenous people in Brazil, and about 50,000 confirmed cases, including over 900 deaths. And those, of course, as you noted in your question, are surely an underestimate. It's not a population that gets caught in the data very well. I was reading some stuff from a human rights lawyer, and her argument was one of the main things needs to be improve access to clean water and transparency of data, which seems, of course, unlikely in the Bolsonaro administration. And that the administration has argued that the health ministry is on it, that they prioritize indigenous peoples with a rollout of vaccinations, et cetera. I'm kind of dubious that that's actually what's happening, but that's the official statement. But the human rights perspectives, we're saying we need to, as you pointed out, Mara, give international attention to this issue, because it's a population that we tend not to give attention to in general, let alone being disproportionately affected by this. So, I mean, that's not a great solution, obviously, but at least if folks that care can raise that up a little bit, then maybe you get some pressure to move testing and move vaccination a little faster.
I'll just kind of jump in, and one other thing that I've kind of noted between both in my research, and I think Laura, you noted this as well, and maybe this is the case in Brazil too. I imagine that it probably is, especially for indigenous populations, but the lack of data across prison populations in different states within the United States, there's just a severe lack and inconsistency in data collection about minority groups and how they're experiencing this. And so, like y'all have noted, there's severe underrepresentation of minorities within these numbers as well. And so, I don't think data is the answer. Like just saying if we collect more data or better data, that'll fix this problem. But I think that that's just one little minor step in a better direction of fully documenting the depths of these problems, because that seems to be a theme that I've heard just kind of across the board here.
I could ask one more question if it's okay.
Do you mind if I
go ahead, Laura? Yeah, please go ahead.
And Liz was saying, I think that's a really important piece. Again, that's not the answer, of course, but if we can't document the overrepresentation and this deep disadvantages and how it's all connected, then of course we can't move people to really care about that. And so I was finding that as late as May of 2020, about half the states in the United States did not include Native American people at all in their data about COVID, and most lumped in, like I said, into the other category. And so it's that we see an overrepresentation with that incomplete data suggests the problem is much more vast than we thought. Sorry, Neve, go ahead.
I can just corroborate that with Israel-Palestine. The same is the case with the Palestinians, and no data collections about the Palestinian and the occupied territories. But I do have a question for Hilal. And one of the major debates about COVID and emergency measures within governments was between the economists and the health professionals. The health professionals came and said, listen, we need to do X, Y, and Z to protect the population. And that meant, in most cases, basically shutting down the economy or slowing the economy dramatically. The economists came back and said, listen, if we slow down the economy dramatically, or if we shut it down, then we have other major problems that will also cost lives, and in many cases, probably more lives. Now, in your article, Hilal, you estimate, and you wrote this way back, but you estimate that, if my numbers might not be correct, but something like 100 million people across the globe will fall into a situation of food insecurity due to COVID and the slowing of the economy and different sides of the economy. And you explain what are the kinds of relations that are going to lead to that they've been going on for many, many years. But the way the food chain and the food production is structured is such that this will be of the effect. So my question is, first, a long time has passed, I think 6 or 9 months since you actually wrote that. Are the numbers you estimated at this time, have they been corroborated? Is this the actual number? And then what could very well end up happening with this pandemic is that we're going to lose much, much more lives due to the economic fallout that occurred, which also has to do with certain hierarchies in the world that people, and then in terms of then the medical fallout. And so it might very well be that in hindsight, we'll think the economists that said keep things open, keep the chain open, were right in terms of, and so what is your opinion about that, Hilal?
Sure. Okay. Thank you for the question, because one of the most important problem right now we are seeing during the COVID-19 period, it affects all kind of bad policies that has been coming along, made impossible to handle. So it's kind of like a inequality gap is becoming bigger and deeper, and it will not be able to really fill this gap. It's kind of like a exasperating kind of effect of the all problems that we are having, which is hunger and malnutrition. The food and the health is actually, it's very, very similar, very, very together, because as you know, COVID-19 is more deadly if we have an underlying condition or if there is a weak immune system. If we look at the word about the hunger and malnutrition, the millions are not even showing the reality to us. Yes, we affected 100. There was a prediction 9 months ago, 100 million, but this prediction came 245 million in 2-3 months ago from the World Food Program. And World Food Program was keep saying this, but at the end, there was a report that extreme hunger, which is just about the starvation or famine, that people die from hunger, not from COVID or not from anything, but from hunger. This is the 245 million people. That is incredible. So if you put on top of it the economic situations, and people will not be able to bring food to their home because they cannot work, or they are essential workers that they keep becoming sick. So we are basically talking about 1 billion people around the world that they are food insecure. This is before the COVID-19. So after the COVID-19, this record is so high, and they don't want to really make it right now. They are calculating how to explain to the world that should not be really a kind of shocking to the world. So that is a big problem. So there have to be some kind of balance between opening economy or closing down. When they close the economy, they will be able to protect people that are middle class. that are people that we are like we are sitting at home, we are still working, and we don't have to go out to get our livelihood. But if we talk about hunger is related with, as you know, poverty. And now, because of COVID, it's an incredible, huge amount of poverty. I put somewhere else the new kind of figure about the poverty. But I think, as far as I remember, now it's 8% is extreme poverty right now in the world, which is very strange because last 10 years it was continuously reduced. So we have to really deal with the extreme poverty, food insecurity. This doesn't mean that we all lump together all whole 1 billion people in the one same pool, because there are 5 different levels of the food insecurity according to FAO. So we are talking about emergency situation. We are talking about real, just about to go to starvation and starvation, which is level 3, level 4, level 5. I'm not going to details technical definition, but it is skyrocketing. Thank God the sub-Saharan Africa, which is the most food insecure people live there, impact of the COVID-19 is less serious than Europe and Latin American countries. The reason possibly they have a more higher immune system to viruses and parasites, or their health system is much more answerable to such kind of health issues, because the pandemic is not the first time that Africa is suffering. So health system is primitive, but they can answer better than the US or Europe, more sophisticated health system, but they cannot handle this kind of ordinary issues that could avoid COVID. These are several reasons that, thank God, really severe food insecurity places COVID effects less than direct effects. But when you talk about the economic impact, it's very important, serious, because transportation of the food, first of all, farmers cannot sell their food to the market. It's this is again everywhere, but also the sub-Saharan Africa is not part of the global food system. So they are handling the local levels, which is much better. But if we are more developed, more modernized, we rely on outsiders. When we rely on outsiders, we have more difficulties. So these sophisticated global food chains are broken. So there is a positive and negative side, being a kind of immune to disasters or coming like a shock. So that's a very interesting give and take.
Thanks so much, Halal. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a final question or two before we wrap up this session? You can either just drop into the box that you have a question, or you can raise your hand.
Angela, while we wait for any other questions, could I add a couple comments that I think connect to Neve's question and to Halal's response? Just focusing a little bit on one particular reservation in the United States, Pine Ridge, which is notoriously the most impoverished place in the country. Unemployment rates pre-COVID were 80+%. Life expectancy for a male on Pine Ridge is 48 and a female 52, shockingly below the average in the United States. And these were places where already there was a lack of employment. Now, of course, COVID made that way worse. This is also a tract of land, 3,500 square miles, that has only 3 grocery stores on it. So food insecurity was already a problem with at least a quarter of the population, probably significantly more of that, made much more difficult by that lack of grocery stores in general and the physical distance to get to those, when many also have unreliable transportation from the get-go. And also there's a lot of documentation of predatory opportunism in those grocery stores, where prices are much, much higher because they can be, because that's the only choices. And so I just think it really, again, kind of connects to what Hillel is talking about, this issue of, that it's a grappling, right, of economy, but food and all of those weaving together, in particular on this reservation.
Well, if I add something about this, your important specificity about the United States is very interesting, because not many countries knows about this food desert, what we talk about them. Many people in the United States, they live in places that they cannot reach shorter than 1 mile to go to get just the water or bread. That is a very, very serious issue. And we don't see too many places. We do see in the United States. So it's very interesting to explain to the other outsiders, the most richest country in the world, how possible we have still 48 million people are food insecure. How do you explain this? They can't really understand. This is but of course with the COVID, let alone this, even the lower middle class right now, they are food insecure. Miles and miles, they were waiting for just food in front of the food banks. This is unheard. So it's very difficult.
Absolutely. And, 95% of kids, I'm using the example of Pine Ridge because it is the worst of the worst, are on free and reduced lunch that they get through schools. Yeah. But then, of course, that's another layer of the problem. The schools weren't operational. And so that's one source that could have been not necessarily the best food, but at least some food. But I did read on a positive side, positive for the peoples, not necessarily any kind of structural solution, but that a lot of Native Americans are returning to kind of traditional canning and dehydration and planting of seeds and things that maybe they hadn't been doing as much of, and going back to kind of their roots to address their food insecurity issue. But again, that doesn't address the structural problems that should not exist in the first place. And as you said, the richest nation in the country, in the planet.
Well, actually, it is very interesting. COVID-19 really make people think about going to more local self-sufficiency, getting food in their backyard. For instance, just before the COVID came, I was on a mission trip in Zimbabwe. The 65% of Zimbabweans are food insecure and seriously food insecure. But what they do, they don't rely on anything. They have little backyard. They have a little bit of vegetables. They really deal with their own. Of course, it's not nutritious. It is not maybe good for young children because they have no they have no protein whatsoever, only carbohydrates. But at the same time, all vegetables, which is a good thing. They were able to survive. As I told you, survival instinct is more stronger right now everywhere than used to be. I'm not talking about people living in London, of course.
Thanks so much. I don't see that we have any more questions, so I think we've probably reached time. I want to thank you all, Neve, Elizabeth, Hillel, and Lara, for this absolutely brilliant and insightful discussion. And I think in many ways, you've started to map out these issues in various areas, but I feel like we'll probably come back to this in a year or two to, look at how these issues actually have evolved over time. And I think it's really interesting to see how, in prisons and food systems and also in Native American communities that, there are some promising things on the horizon, but yet the structures actually remain very much the same. So I want to thank you all again so much for being part of this panel, for contributing to the State Crime Journal. I want to also thank Gulsh as well for her never-ending support to the International State Crime Initiative and making all the events that we've been doing possible. And just as a final note, you can find all of our events on the International State Crime Initiative events page at Queen Mary, or you can follow us at State Crime on Twitter. We have a really interesting talk planned for next Wednesday at 5 p.m. With Professor Christian Laslet, who will be talking to us about global networks of corruption. And so please do join us to hear from him. He does some absolutely fascinating and really methodologically innovative work. So we hope that you can actually join us here again next week. So thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and close the session.